On April 4, 1884, in the snow country town of Nagaoka, Japan, a schoolteacher named Sadayoshi Takano became a father for the 6th time at the age of 56. He named the boy Isoroku, which means 56 in Japanese, a wry acknowledgement of his advanced years. The child would grow up to become the most famous admiral in Japanese history, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the man who understood American power better than any other Japanese military leader. 4 decades later, that same man sat in a cramped bomber, flying low over the Solomon Islands jungle. He wore a simple green army uniform instead of his white naval dress, a gesture of solidarity with the ground troops he was visiting. He checked his watch. They were precisely on schedule, exactly as he preferred. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was famously punctual. It was a trait that would kill him. 1,000 miles to the southeast, 16 American fighter pilots were racing toward the same patch of sky. They had been airborne for more than 2 hours, skimming the wave tops at 50 feet to avoid radar detection. They carried enough fuel for perhaps 10 minutes of combat over the target. If their calculations were wrong by even a few miles, they would run out of fuel and crash into the Pacific. If their timing was off by more than a few minutes, they would miss their target entirely. Their target was Yamamoto himself. The Americans arrived at the intercept point at 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute ahead of schedule. They looked up and saw the Japanese formation exactly where intelligence said it would be. 2 bombers, 6 escort fighters, descending toward a jungle airstrip. What happened next would become one of the most controversial air engagements of the Second World War. But there was nothing controversial about the outcome. Within seconds, Yamamoto's bomber was spiraling into the jungle, trailing black smoke. Japan's greatest admiral was dead before his aircraft hit the ground. The mission that killed Yamamoto represented something unprecedented in military history. It was the longest fighter interception mission ever attempted. It required navigation across 1,000 miles of open ocean using nothing but a compass, a wristwatch, and dead reckoning. It depended on intelligence so secret that America would guard the source for years after the war ended, and it arrived at its target with a precision that still astonishes military historians 8 decades later. This is the story of how 18 P-38s flew 1,000 miles to kill Japan's greatest admiral. It begins not in the Pacific, but in the United States, where Yamamoto spent years studying the nation he would later attack. Isoroku Takano, as he was then known, graduated near the top of his class from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1904. Within months of graduation, he was at war. Japan and Russia were fighting for dominance in East Asia, and the young ensign found himself aboard the armored cruiser Nishin during the decisive Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. The battle was a catastrophe for Russia. The Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Squadron, sinking or capturing virtually every enemy ship. It was the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar a century earlier, but for Ensign Takano, the victory came at a personal cost. A shell explosion aboard Nishin killed dozens of his shipmates and left him severely wounded. He lost his index and middle fingers on his left hand, a disability he would carry for the rest of his life. The injury became something of a calling card. Years later, when Yamamoto visited geisha houses, the women would charge him only 80 sen for a manicure instead of the standard 100, a playful acknowledgement of his missing digits. He bore the disfigurement with characteristic humor. In 1916, Isoroku Takano was adopted by the Yamamoto family to continue their lineage. This was a common practice in Japan for families without male heirs. He took their name and became Isoroku Yamamoto, the name history would remember. Yamamoto first came to America in 1919, enrolling at Harvard University to study English, economics, and petroleum resources. He was 35 years old, a naval officer already marked for advancement. His superiors had selected him for this posting because they recognized his intellectual abilities and wanted him to understand the nation that was emerging as a potential rival in the Pacific. At Harvard, Yamamoto immersed himself in American culture with characteristic thoroughness. He attended classes diligently, but he learned as much outside the classroom as within it. He hitchhiked across the country during summer breaks, visiting oil fields in Texas and Mexico. He wanted to understand where America's industrial power came from, to see the sources of the wealth that was transforming the nation into a global force. He learned to play poker and became formidable at it, studying American psychology through the cards. Poker taught him how Americans thought, how they bluffed, how they calculated risk. These lessons would prove useful when he later planned operations against American forces. Most importantly, he observed the automobile factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He saw assembly lines producing goods at a pace that Japanese industry could not match. He understood that if these factories ever converted to war production, they would generate weapons in quantities that would overwhelm any opponent. His second American posting came in January 1926, when he arrived in Washington as a naval attaché. For 2 years, he visited American naval bases, observed training exercises, and cultivated relationships with American officers. He played bridge with them, dined with them, learned their habits and their thinking. He also learned their capacity for industrial mobilization. He studied American history, particularly the Civil War, when northern factories had outproduced the agricultural South and ground the Confederacy into submission through sheer material advantage. He saw that pattern repeating in the modern age. Any nation that went to war with America had better win quickly, because America's industrial might would prove decisive in a long conflict. These experiences shaped Yamamoto's strategic vision in ways his colleagues never fully understood. While other Japanese military leaders dismissed Americans as soft and undisciplined, Yamamoto knew better. He had lived among them. He had seen their energy, their optimism, their boundless capacity for work. He understood what those factories could produce if mobilized for war. When Yamamoto returned to Japan in March 1928, he brought with him a profound respect for American power that would inform his thinking for the rest of his career. He rose steadily through the naval hierarchy, commanding ships and air groups, earning a reputation as an innovative thinker and a skilled administrator. By the late 1930s, Yamamoto had become one of the most prominent figures in the Japanese Navy. He opposed the Tripartite Pact that allied Japan with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, believing it would inevitably draw Japan into conflict with the United States. His opposition was so vocal that he received death threats from nationalist extremists. He was assigned to sea duty partly to protect him from assassination. As Deputy Navy Minister and later Commander of the Combined Fleet, Yamamoto consistently warned against war with America. In the autumn of 1940, shortly after Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, Yamamoto delivered a warning that would prove prophetic. Speaking to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, he said that, if ordered to fight, he would run wild and win victory upon victory for the first 6 to 12 months. But after that, he had no expectation of success. The industrial capacity of the United States was simply too vast for Japan to overcome in a prolonged conflict. His warning was ignored. Japan chose war anyway. And once the decision was made, Yamamoto threw himself into the task, with the same intensity he brought to everything. Yamamoto designed the Pearl Harbor attack himself, modelling it on the British Royal Navy raid at Taranto in November 1940, when obsolete biplanes had crippled the Italian fleet at anchor. If the British could strike the Italians in harbour, Yamamoto reasoned, Japan could strike the Americans the same way. He threatened to resign when the Naval General Staff hesitated to approve the plan. The staff officers considered it too risky, too dependent on surprise. Yamamoto insisted that only a devastating first blow could give Japan any hope of success. His audacity carried the day. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft devastated the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack was a tactical masterpiece. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. More than 2,000 American servicemen died. Japan lost only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. But Yamamoto took no joy in the victory. According to his biographer Hiroyuki Ogawa, Yamamoto, alone among his celebrating staff, spent the day after Pearl Harbor sunk in apparent depression. He was particularly disturbed that Japan's declaration of war had been delivered 55 minutes after the attack began, turning a surprise assault into what Americans would call a sneak attack. This diplomatic failure, caused by delays in decoding and typing the message at the Japanese embassy in Washington, would inflame American anger and make compromise impossible. In a letter written weeks after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto reflected on the operation with unusual candor. "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy," he wrote. "It is more a matter of shame for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." He was right. America was indeed angered and outraged, and the counterattack would eventually find Yamamoto himself. By early 1943, the war had turned against Japan. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 aircraft carriers at Midway in June 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as Yamamoto had predicted. The Coral Sea battle in May had cost Japan another carrier and prevented the planned invasion of Port Moresby. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal in August and were grinding their way through Japanese defenses at terrible cost to both sides. Yamamoto remained commander of the combined fleet, Japan's most prestigious naval posting. He was a national hero, the Horatio Nelson of Japan, the admiral who had humbled America at Pearl Harbor. His image appeared on propaganda posters throughout the empire. His connections to the imperial family protected him from the army generals who blamed the navy for Japan's mounting difficulties. The Americans knew that Yamamoto's death would be a devastating blow to Japanese morale. He was not just a military commander, but a symbol, the face of Japanese naval power. More importantly, they knew that Yamamoto was the most capable strategic mind in the Japanese Navy. He had planned Pearl Harbor and Midway. He understood naval aviation better than any other Japanese admiral. Removing him from the war would weaken Japan's military leadership at a critical moment. The opportunity to strike came from an unlikely source, a windowless basement beneath the old administration building at Pearl Harbor. There, a team of cryptanalysts worked around the clock-breaking Japanese naval codes. They called themselves the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, or FRUPAC for short. Their work was among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The story of American code breaking in the Pacific is itself a remarkable tale. Before the war, a small group of naval officers and civilian linguists had begun attacking Japanese diplomatic and military codes. Their work had contributed to the American victory at Midway, when codebreakers determined that the Japanese target designated AF was actually Midway Island, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers for a decisive ambush. The FRUPAC team included some of America's finest codebreakers. Marine Major Alva Laswell served as chief linguist. a man so skilled at Japanese that he could detect subtle errors and double meanings in intercepted messages. His nickname was Red, for his hair color, but his colleagues knew him for his extraordinary dedication. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the basement, rarely seeing sunlight. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes supervised the code-breaking effort. He was the same officer who had devised the famous ruse that confirmed Midway as Japan's target. Holmes had instructed the American garrison on Midway to send an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. When Japanese naval traffic subsequently reported that AF was short of fresh water, the Americans knew they had identified the target. Supporting them were cryptanalysts Ham Wright and Tommy Dyer, traffic analysts Tom Huckins and Jack Williams, and junior team members, including a young officer named John Paul Stevens. Stevens was assigned to the traffic analysis desk, a junior position, but he was on duty at critical moments during the war. He would later serve 34 years on the Supreme Court, the third longest tenure in history. The Japanese naval code they attacked was designated JN-25, a system using approximately 33,000 code words represented by 5-digit numbers. Each code group had an additional layer of encryption, a super encipherment that made the system extraordinarily difficult to break. The Japanese periodically changed both the code book and the additive tables, forcing the American cryptanalysts to start over. By April 1943, the Japanese had introduced a new version called JN-25D. The change should have blinded American intelligence for weeks or months. But the codebreakers had become so skilled and had accumulated so much knowledge about Japanese communications patterns that they recovered large portions of the new code within 2 weeks. On April 13, 1943, Japanese time, the codebreakers intercepted a message that made their hearts race. It was designated NTF-131755, sent from the commander of the 11th Air Flotilla to several subordinate units in the Solomon Islands. The message detailed an upcoming inspection tour by a high-ranking officer. Major Laswell worked through the night translating the intercept. The recent code changes made the work difficult, but the message gradually took shape. It listed a departure time from Rabaul at 0600 Tokyo time, arrival at Balali Airfield near Bougainville at 0800 Tokyo time, which translated to 9:45 local time. The officer would travel in a medium bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The flight altitude would be 6,500 feet. The high-ranking officer was Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet. That meant Yamamoto. Processing the complete message took approximately 18 hours due to the recent code changes. When Laswell finished, he and Holmes hand-carried the translation to Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer. Layton immediately recognized the significance. He walked the message personally to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz faced a difficult decision. Killing Yamamoto would be a tremendous coup, but it would also risk exposing the fact that America was reading Japanese codes. The Japanese might change their entire communications system, blinding American intelligence at a critical moment in the war. Nimitz consulted with Vice Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific. Halsey was not a man given to hesitation. His response was characteristically blunt. He sent a message that read simply, "Tally-ho, let's get the bastard." The decision moved up the chain of command. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was involved in the final authorization. He consulted the Navy Judge Advocate General about the legality of targeting a specific enemy commander. He also spoke with churchmen about the morality of what amounted to an assassination. The conclusion was that Yamamoto, as a uniformed military commander in a theater of war directing military operations, was a legitimate target under the laws of armed conflict. Whether President Franklin Roosevelt personally approved the mission remains unclear. Some accounts claim Roosevelt said simply, "Get Yamamoto," but no documentary evidence of his direct involvement has ever been found. What is certain is that the mission was approved at the highest levels of the American government. The British, notably, opposed the operation. Winston Churchill reportedly protested to Roosevelt, with British intelligence officials arguing that killing any single admiral was not worth the risk of compromising Allied code-breaking capabilities. The British had their own code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park and understood how valuable and how fragile such intelligence was. Their objection was overruled. The tactical challenges of intercepting Yamamoto were formidable. The intercept point near Bougainville lay approximately 400 miles from the American airbase at Guadalcanal. The round-trip distance of roughly 1,000 miles exceeded the range of any Navy or Marine Corps fighter aircraft. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair simply could not make the journey. Only one American fighter could reach the target and still have fuel to fight. That aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was an unusual aircraft, a twin-engine, twin-boom design that looked like nothing else in the sky. It had been designed in the late 1930s as a high-altitude interceptor, capable of climbing to extreme altitudes to attack enemy bombers. Its twin Allison engines gave it speed and range that single-engine fighters could not match. The P-38 carried 300 gallons of internal fuel, giving it a range of roughly 700 miles. But with external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings, this extended to nearly 1,900 miles. For the Yamamoto mission, each aircraft would carry an asymmetric load, one 165-gallon tank under one wing and one 330-gallon tank under the other. The larger tanks had to be flown up from Port Moresby specifically for this mission. The weight difference between the two tanks placed roughly 1,000 extra pounds on one side of the aircraft, but because the load was close to the center of gravity, the handling remained manageable. The pilots would jettison the tanks before combat, restoring normal flight characteristics. The P-38's armament was devastating. 450 caliber Browning machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon, all concentrated in the nose of the aircraft. Unlike wing-mounted guns on other fighters, these weapons required no convergence calculations. Whatever the pilot aimed at, the guns would hit. The concentrated firepower could tear an enemy aircraft apart in seconds. The P-38 would eventually shoot down more Japanese aircraft in the Pacific Theater than any other American fighter type, accounting for more than 1,800 confirmed victories. On April 18, 1943, it was about to claim its most famous victim. Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was selected to lead the mission. Mitchell was a 28-year-old from Enid, Mississippi, a small town in the state's northeastern corner. He had attended Columbia University, studying economics before joining the Army Air Corps. He had arrived on Guadalcanal in October 1942, flying P-39 Airacobras before transitioning to P-38s. By April 1943, he was an ace with 8 confirmed kills. Mitchell personally calculated the intercept time. Marine Major John Condon had prepared an initial flight plan, but Mitchell rejected key elements and revised the calculations himself. Working backward from Yamamoto's scheduled arrival at Belalai, Mitchell determined that the intercept should occur at 9:35 in the morning, local time. The problem was getting there. The direct route from Guadalcanal to Bougainville would take the American fighters over Japanese-held islands, where they could be spotted and reported. Mitchell designed a circuitous 4-leg route that would take his fighters southwest over the Coral Sea, then west around the Solomon Chain, then north and finally northeast toward Bougainville. The outbound route covered approximately 600 miles. The return would be shorter, roughly 400 miles, because the fighters could fly directly home once their mission was complete and secrecy no longer mattered. Mitchell estimated the odds of success at 1,000 to 1. Navigation across open ocean for more than 2 hours, maintaining precise timing to intercept an aircraft that would be over the target area for only minutes, seemed almost impossible. But impossible was the only option. The plan called for 18 P-38s. 4 would form a killer flight tasked with shooting down the bombers carrying Yamamoto. The remaining 14 would fly top cover at 18,000 feet, engaging any Japanese fighters that tried to intervene. The cover flight would not descend unless the killer flight got into serious trouble. The pilots were selected from multiple squadrons of the 347th Fighter Group. The killer flight was assigned to Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. as element leader, with Lieutenant Rex Barber as his wingman. Lieutenants Jim McClanahan and Joe Moore would complete the 4-ship formation. The night before the mission, Mitchell borrowed a Navy ship compass from Marine Lieutenant Colonel Luther S. Moore, Fighter Command's deputy. The standard P-38 compass was unreliable for the precision navigation required, subject to errors from the aircraft's electrical systems and metal structure. Mitchell installed the borrowed compass himself on the afternoon of April 17. The pilots were briefed that evening. They were told they would be intercepting a high-ranking Japanese officer, though most sources suggest they were not specifically told the target was Yamamoto. Security was paramount. If the Japanese learned the Americans had known exactly where and when to find the target, they would realize their codes were compromised. At 7:25 on the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightnings began rolling down the runway at Kukum Field, also known as Fighter 2, on Guadalcanal. The date was exactly 1 year and 4 months after Pearl Harbor. The Americans were about to deliver a very personal response. Almost immediately, disaster struck. McClanahan's aircraft blew a tire on takeoff. The rubber shredded, making the aircraft uncontrollable. He was forced to abort, his P-38 lurching off the runway and grinding to a halt. Moments later, Moore discovered that his drop tanks would not feed fuel to his engines. A mechanical failure, perhaps a blockage in the fuel lines, made his extra fuel useless. He aborted as well. The killer flight was now reduced to 2 aircraft. Lanphier and Barber would have to do the job alone. This was a critical problem. The plan had called for 4 fighters attacking the bombers, giving them multiple angles of approach and redundancy if any aircraft was shot down. Now there was no margin for error. Mitchell made a quick decision. Lieutenants Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine, originally assigned to the cover flight, were hastily designated as replacements for the killer flight. They would fly as a second element behind Lanphier and Barber. Holmes was experienced, a capable pilot who had seen combat before. Hine was newer to the squadron, but he was available and his aircraft was functioning. 16 P-38s formed up and headed west, climbing to just 50 feet above the ocean. They would fly for more than 2 hours at this altitude, wave hopping to avoid detection by Japanese radar stations on the islands they were circumnavigating. The salt spray kicked up by their propellers left white streaks on their windscreens. The pilots flew in close formation, wingtip to wingtip, following Mitchell's lead aircraft. Radio silence was absolute. Any transmission could be picked up by Japanese listening posts and would alert the enemy that American aircraft were approaching. The pilots communicated only through hand signals and the positioning of their aircraft. Mitchell navigated while fighting drowsiness in the tropical heat. The P-38 cockpit was a greenhouse surrounded by glass that trapped the equatorial sun. The canopy could not be opened without disrupting the carefully calculated fuel consumption. Sweat soaked through flight suits. Some pilots counted sharks in the water below to stay alert. The route took them southwest over the Coral Sea, away from Japanese-held islands, then curved westward around the southern end of the Solomon Chain. At each turning point, Mitchell checked his compass, his watch, and his airspeed indicator. These three instruments were his only guide across the featureless ocean. Any error in calculation, any drift from the planned course would mean failure. At approximately 9:30, light haze forced the formation to climb to 2,000 feet. Mitchell was concerned. They were approaching the intercept point. If they had miscalculated, if Yamamoto had been delayed, or had changed his route, the mission would fail. Worse, if Japanese fighters spotted them before they found the bombers, they would have to jettison their drop tanks and fight, burning fuel they needed to get home. At 9:34, 1 minute ahead of schedule, Lieutenant Doug Canning called out over the radio, breaking the long silence. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high." Mitchell looked up and felt a surge of relief mixed with astonishment. The Japanese formation was exactly where intelligence said it would be. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, the type the Americans called Betty, flying at 6,500 feet, descending toward Balalay airstrip. 6 Mitsubishi. A 6 M0 fighters positioned at 4 o'clock relative to the bombers, 1,500 feet higher, flying protective escort. The navigation had been perfect. 2 hours and 15 minutes of dead reckoning across open ocean, and they had arrived within 1 minute of the planned intercept time. The Japanese aircraft were exactly where they were supposed to be. Mitchell radioed Lanphier with the prearranged code. "All right, Tom, go get him. He's your meat." The killer flight jettisoned their drop tanks and began climbing toward the Japanese formation. The cover flight continued to higher altitude, ready to engage any Zeros that tried to interfere, but things immediately went wrong. Holmes discovered that his drop tanks would not release. The external tanks hung beneath his wings, disrupting his aircraft's aerodynamics and adding drag and weight that would make dogfighting nearly impossible. He and his wingman Hine peeled away from the formation, desperately trying to shake the tanks loose through violent maneuvering. Lanphier and Barber were now alone against 2 bombers and 6 fighters. The Japanese reacted instantly to the approaching P-38s. The Zero pilots had spotted the American fighters climbing toward them. Both Betty bombers immediately dove for the treetops, trying to escape by flying low, where they could use the jungle terrain for cover. One turned east toward the jungle interior. The other turned west toward the sea. The 6 Zeros dropped their own external tanks and dove to intercept the Americans. What happened next would be debated for decades. The aerial engagement lasted only seconds, but the accounts of those seconds differ dramatically. According to Lanphier, he pulled up into a head-on attack against the diving Zeros. He claimed to have shot down one of the fighters, sending it spinning into the jungle. Then, he said, he flipped his aircraft inverted, spotted the lead Betty below and to his right, and dove down to attack from a steep deflection angle. He reported that he opened fire and shot off the bomber's right wing in what he later called a lucky shot. According to Barber, events unfolded differently. He said that Lanphier engaged the Zeros while Barber himself pursued the bombers. Barber banked hard to get behind the lead Betty, which was diving for the trees. He closed to less than 100 feet, point-blank range, and opened fire with his 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns. Barber's rounds struck the Betty's right engine, rear fuselage, tail section, and left engine in rapid succession. Heavy black smoke erupted from the aircraft. The bomber snap rolled left and down, nearly colliding with Barber's P-38. Barber yanked his control column back to avoid the collision, passing so close he could see details of the bomber's structure. A column of black smoke rose from the jungle where the Betty crashed. The second Betty was damaged by Holmes, who had finally shed his drop tanks after several agonizing minutes of violent maneuvering. Holmes and Barber both fired on this aircraft, sending it trailing smoke toward the water near Moyler Point. The bomber crash landed in the shallow water offshore. 3 occupants survived, including Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff. Ugaki had been in the second aircraft, not the first. The entire engagement had lasted only seconds. The Zeros, having failed to prevent the attack on the bombers, now turned on the American fighters with fury. Lieutenant Raymond Hine was last seen trailing vapor with Zeros in pursuit. He never returned. His body and aircraft were never found. The surviving pilots turned for home. As they approached Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Lanphier broke radio silence. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House," he announced triumphantly. The question of who actually shot down Yamamoto's aircraft has generated more controversy than any other aspect of Operation Vengeance. For decades, Lanphier claimed sole credit for the kill. Barber contested this claim with equal vehemence. The dispute consumed both men for the rest of their lives. The physical evidence strongly supports Barber's account. Japanese Army engineers found the crash site the following day. Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna led the search party into the jungle north of Bougainville. The coordinates were later recorded as 6 degrees 47 minutes south latitude, 155 degrees 33 minutes east longitude. They found Yamamoto's aircraft in pieces among the trees, the wreckage scattered across a wide area. The Admiral himself had been thrown clear of the aircraft on impact. According to Hamasuna's account, Yamamoto was found still upright in his seat beneath a tree, his white-gloved hand grasping the hilt of his katana sword, head bowed as if deep in thought. This dignified posture may have resulted from the crash dynamics, or perhaps someone arranged the body as a final act of reverence. The truth is uncertain. The post-mortem examination revealed 2 .50 caliber bullet wounds. One had entered the back of his left shoulder, the other had entered his left lower jaw and exited above his right eye. The head wound was fatal. Medical officers determined that Yamamoto was dead before his aircraft hit the ground. Both entry wounds came from behind the aircraft. This is entirely consistent with Barber's account of attacking from directly behind the bomber at close range. It directly contradicts Lanphier's claim of firing from a steep side angle, which would have produced entry wounds from the side, not the rear. Multiple ground inspections of the crash site confirmed that all visible gunfire damage to the wreckage was caused by bullets entering from immediately behind the bomber, not from the side. The right wing that Lanphier claimed to have shot off was found lying next to the fuselage, indicating it had torn off during impact with trees rather than being shot off in flight. Japanese military records provide further evidence. Detailed after-action reports confirm that no Zero fighters were shot down in the engagement. 1 Zero required minor repairs but returned to service the same day. This directly contradicts Lanphier's claim of shooting down a Zero before attacking the bomber. Kenji Yanagiya, one of the 6 Zero pilots escorting Yamamoto, survived the war and eventually spoke about the mission. For 30 years he remained silent, burdened by shame at having failed to protect his commander. Finally, in the 1970s, he told his story to Japanese writer Akira Yoshimura. Yanagiya testified that he saw Yamamoto's bomber crash 20 to 30 seconds after being hit from behind by P-38 fire. At that moment, according to Yanagiya, Lanphier was engaged with Zeros heading in the opposite direction, away from the bombers. Yanagiya's eyewitness account supports Barber's version of events. In 1988, Yanagiya traveled to Texas and met his former American adversaries at the Admiral Nimitz Museum. The aging pilots, once enemies, shook hands and compared memories of that morning 45 years earlier. The damage to the returning American aircraft also tells its story. Barber's P-38, a borrowed aircraft named Miss Virginia because his regular plane was down for maintenance, returned to Guadalcanal with 104 bullet holes. This extraordinary amount of damage indicates intense close combat, exactly what would be expected from an aircraft that had pressed home an attack at close range while Zeros swarmed around it. Lanfear's aircraft, named Phoebe, returned with only 2 bullet holes. This minimal damage suggests he had not been in the thick of the fighting over the bombers. The Air Force conducted multiple reviews of the controversy over the decades. A 1978 Air Force historical study formally codified a split credit between Lanfear and Barber. A 1985 Victory Credit Board convened specifically to examine the evidence. A 1991 Board for Correction of Military Records deadlocked on the question. In 1993, Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice ruled that the existing shared credit should stand. Barber sued in federal court, seeking to have the official record corrected. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Rice's authority to make the determination, but the controversy did not end there. Lanfear's claimed zero kill was eventually examined against Japanese records. When those records confirmed that no Zeros were lost in the engagement, the claim was revoked. This dropped Lanfear's total confirmed victories from 5 to 4, costing him his status as an ace. In 2003, Oregon's governor and legislature officially proclaimed Rex T. Barber Day and credited him with the sole kill of Yamamoto. In 2024, Air Force historian Daniel Hallman, who had served on the 1985 Review Board, publicly reversed his earlier position. He stated that he had become convinced that credit for shooting down Yamamoto's plane really should go to Rex Barber. The historical consensus now strongly favors Barber, though official Air Force records still list shared credit. Japan kept Yamamoto's death secret for more than a month. The government needed time to prepare the nation for the shock. When the announcement finally came on May 21, 1943, the impact was devastating. Radio monitors who heard the Tokyo broadcast reported that the announcer seemed overcome with the weight of his news. His voice choked as if through tears. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, who wrote the official history of United States naval operations in World War II, called Yamamoto's death the equivalent of a major defeat in battle. Admiral Minechi Koga, selected as Yamamoto's successor, said simply that there was only one Yamamoto, and no one could replace him. The state funeral on June 5, 1943, was only the second ever given to a Japanese naval officer. The first had been for Admiral Heihachiro Togo, the victor of Tsushima, who had died in 1934. The honor was unprecedented for someone outside the aristocracy. Yamamoto's ashes, cremated at Buin and transported home aboard the battleship Musashi, the largest warship Japan ever built, were carried through Tokyo while 1 million people lined the streets in silent mourning. The funeral procession deliberately passed the quarters of Kawai Chiyoko, his favorite geisha, allowing her to pay her respects. His ashes were divided between Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, where he lies beside Admiral Togo, and his ancestral burial grounds in Nagaoka. Posthumous honors poured in. Yamamoto was elevated to Marshal Admiral, the highest naval rank, equivalent to a 5-star fleet admiral in the American system. He received the Order of the Chrysanthemum First Class, Japan's highest decoration. Even Nazi Germany honored him, awarding the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the only time that decoration was given to a Japanese officer. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained absolute secrecy about how they had known Yamamoto's itinerary. The cover story attributed the intelligence to Australian coast watchers, brave volunteers who hid on Japanese-occupied islands and reported enemy movements by radio. According to this story, a coast watcher had spotted a high-ranking officer boarding an aircraft at Rabaul and radioed the information to Allied headquarters. The truth about the code breaking would not be revealed until September 1945, after Japan's surrender, when there was no longer any reason to protect the secret. The Japanese had never suspected that their codes were compromised. Security was not perfectly maintained in the immediate aftermath. On May 31, 1943, Time magazine published details that hinted strongly at the true source of the intelligence. In October, the magazine named Lanfear specifically and provided enough details that a careful reader could deduce that the Americans had known in advance exactly when and where Yamamoto would be flying. The Navy was furious. Such leaks could have compromised the entire code-breaking operation. As a consequence, Major Mitchell's Medal of Honor nomination was downgraded to a Navy Cross. All 4 killer flight pilots received Navy Crosses rather than the nation's highest honor, their recognition diminished by the security breach they had not caused. Remarkably, Japan never changed the JN-25 code. Despite losing their greatest admiral in circumstances that could have suggested intelligence compromise, the Japanese High Command apparently concluded that the interception was coincidental, an unlucky encounter with an American patrol. The American codebreakers' work remained secret until the war's end, continuing to provide invaluable intelligence for operations throughout the Pacific. The sole American casualty was Lieutenant Raymond Hine. His family was notified that he was missing in action. His body and his aircraft were never found, presumably lost in the deep waters or dense jungle around Bougainville. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his role in the mission. Japanese pilot Yanagiya later admitted that he may have damaged Hine's aircraft during the engagement, though no Zero pilot claimed a definite kill that day. The exact circumstances of Hine's death remain unknown. The pilots who survived Operation Vengeance went on to varied fates. Major John Mitchell continued flying combat missions in the Pacific. After the war, he remained in the Air Force and served in Korea, commanding the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing. He shot down 4 MiG-15 jets, adding to his World War II record. He retired as a colonel and died on November 15, 1995, at the age of 81. Captain Thomas Lanfear left the military after the war and pursued a career in journalism and business. He became editor of the Idaho Daily Statesman newspaper. He served as president of the Air Force Association in 1947 and 48. He maintained his claim to have shot down Yamamoto until his death from cancer on November 26, 1987. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Lieutenant Rex Barber became a test pilot after the war, flying the new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. He was shot down over China on April 29, 1944, while flying a combat mission, but he evaded capture and eventually returned to American lines. He contested Lanfear's claim for the rest of his life and lived to see the historical consensus shift in his favor. He died on July 26, 2001 at the age of 84. Oregon honored him by naming a bridge after him, the Rex T. Barber Veterans Memorial Bridge. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived the crash of the second Betty bomber, outlived Yamamoto by more than 2 years. On August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Ugaki refused to accept defeat. He strapped on the short sword that Yamamoto had given him years earlier, climbed into a dive bomber, and led a final kamikaze mission against American ships off Okinawa. His aircraft was shot down by American anti-aircraft fire before reaching its target. His body was later found on Iheya Island, north of Okinawa. In death, he followed his commander. The question of whether killing Yamamoto shortened the war has no definitive answer. Japan never won another major Pacific battle after his death. His successor Koga lacked Yamamoto's brilliance and creativity. Koga adopted an essentially defensive posture, abandoning the aggressive operations that Yamamoto had favored. Koga himself died in a typhoon-related plane crash on March 31, 1944, less than a year after taking command. But by April 1943, Japan had already lost the strategic initiative. The destruction of 4 carriers at Midway had crippled Japanese offensive capability. American shipyards were producing new carriers, new aircraft, new submarines, faster than Japan could replace its losses. American pilots were being trained in numbers that dwarfed Japanese capacity. The industrial superiority that Yamamoto had warned about was becoming decisive. What Operation Vengeance demonstrated was something perhaps more important than any single tactical victory. It showed that American intelligence could reach into the most secret Japanese communications. It showed that American aircraft could strike anywhere, at any time, with devastating precision. It showed that America would pursue its enemies relentlessly, across 1,000 miles of ocean if necessary. The mission remains one of the most remarkable feats of aerial navigation in military history. Mitchell had only a compass, a wristwatch, and his own calculations to guide 16 aircraft across hundreds of miles of open water. He arrived at the intercept point within 60 seconds of the planned time. The target appeared exactly where intelligence predicted. Such precision seemed almost impossible, yet Mitchell and his pilots achieved it. Yamamoto would have appreciated the irony. He had spent years warning his government about American capabilities. He understood their organizational skills, their technical ingenuity, their relentless determination. He had told Prime Minister Conway that Japan could run wild for a year at most before American power became overwhelming. In the end, that American power found him personally. The same nation he had studied and respected, the same industrial and organizational might he had warned his colleagues about, reached across the Pacific and struck him down in the skies over Bougainville. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The jungle has long since reclaimed the crash site where Yamamoto died. The wreckage has rusted and crumbled. The men who flew that mission, on both sides, have passed into history. But the story of Operation Vengeance endures. It stands as testament to what determined men can accomplish when they commit themselves fully to a task that seems impossible, and as proof that even the most powerful admiral is not beyond the reach of those he underestimated.